I think the most important thing that one must look at here is that the beginning of bebop. Many people said it was birthed in New York City or the East Coast. And you got to look at the 1940s from a music perspective, looking at the music, African American music, a creation called bebop. And there was Stan Levey, who at the time was probably listening to and recording with some of the giants of the early innovation called bebop, with Miles, with Charlie Parker, and above all, with Dizzy Gillespie. When you look at some of the other drummers in the community at that time, guys like Roy Haynes, Max Roach, and Art Blakey, these people were major players in the movement. But you've also got to look at Stan Levey. Stan Levey made a major impact in terms of this music in New York City. When you look at Stan's background, it wasn't to be. So Stan had something unique going on in terms of his own concept of bebop, African American music, and the love of this music.
When I was just a kid, about 6 or 7, I always played with spoons and knives, and I had a rhythm, things, I just had to get that out. And I would listen to the radio and beat the spoons and beat the knife and the fork and drive my parents crazy. So one day they decided to get me a little tiny drum set. It was not professional, a very little tiny thing. Snare drum, a bass drum, and a cymbal. And I would put the bass drum up against the radio in the living room and play along with the band. What I played along was with Ozzie Nelson, and it was called the Clico Club Eskimos. That was the name of the band, with Harriet Hilliard, his wife, and they went on to have a TV show for a long time. And that was something to play along too, and I think that inherently got me into the feel of the music, playing with someone. And I did that for a long time. My first experience with a real professional drummer was at a time when I was 12 years old. My father knew I loved the drums and the music and everything. He took me to the Earl Theater in Philadelphia to see Chick Webb, who was a big-time band leader at that time. So I went in, the curtains opened in this gigantic theater, and I'm looking and looking for the drummer. All I saw was this huge bass drum and cymbals. And then I looked closer, there was his head sitting right behind the bass drum, and the cymbals hanging over, and these arms flailing and playing the greatest drums I ever heard in my life up to that point. And what I didn't know was Chick was a hunchback. He was about 4'11", 4'10". And he played the most fantastic musical drums. First time I'd ever heard that. And the singer in the band was Ella Fitzgerald, who at that time was 15. And lo and behold, 40 years later, I became her drummer and toured all over the world with Ella Fitzgerald. So what goes around comes around. It was quite an experience to see those two. I'm a very lucky man, really lucky. My first job as a drummer, professional job, at the age of 16, was with Dizzy Gillespie. Now, how lucky can a guy get? A white kid out of Philadelphia, no experience, but I had it all in here. It was all there, built in. No drum lessons, didn't have any drums. It was all built in. I heard it, I could do it. And I went up to Downbeat Club to hear this fantastic trumpeter and the little group that he had up there. And it was a revelation to hear them. It was really, he sounded like Roy Eldridge, but he was taking a left-hand turn. You could hear it. He would run through the changes a little bit different. And I stayed all night, and he came back. As he came off the stand, he started talking to me. And I said, well, I'm a drummer too, you know, cocky little kid. He says, you're a drummer? Well, come on up and play a little bit, which I did. And he liked it.
I mean, Diz was cool. He had these horn-rimmed glasses, and he had this knit bebop hat.
Now, you talk about luck. No experience, but I had the sound. Somehow, it was built in. And he hired me to play with his band in the Downbeat Club in Philadelphia. Talk about luck. But I had the ability to do it. And he knew that, and I'll never forget him for that. He really launched me.
I didn't know he was such a great friend of Dizzy Gillespie, but he must have been because of being asked to play in the famous band that he took. It was an amazing band that he played in.
When he came into the jazz world as a young person at the same time that jazz was transforming and a new, entirely new kind of jazz was beginning to come onto the scene, Stan was very fortunate, or maybe very aggressive or arrogant or whatever, that he got himself onto the scene and began to play at the beginning with the very heart of this new music. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, it doesn't get any more central than that. But he did. And so he came to it without any preconceptions about what jazz should or shouldn't be, and had the great good fortune to experience this music as it was being born.
At the same time I was in Philadelphia playing at the Downbeat Club, Benny Goodman was at the Earl Theater, and Zoot Sims, who was in the band, used to come and play with us at night. And he liked the way I play, and he told Benny about it, and Benny arranged an audition with the band. And I called my mother and said, "Mom, I'm going to be with Benny Goodman at the Earl Theater." She said, "Shut up. Don't tell me stories like that. I don't want to hear it." I said, "Mom, I'm going to be with Benny Goodman at 9 o'clock in the morning. Just forget it. Just leave me alone. Leave me alone." So, okay, so the next morning I'm there. I've never been with a big band. I've never been on a stage. I never really had a real set of drums. And there I am with the #1 band in the country. #1, Benny Goodman at that time. Talk about nerve. But I knew his music in my head. I knew it. I knew the records. I knew the feeling of it. Was able to do it. So the curtains opens, and I'm looking at this thing, a cavernous theater. It's enormous, with the red and blue lights. And my God, where am I? And I look down the first row. There's my mother. Her mouth is like 3 feet open. She couldn't believe it, you know. So we got through the show. And Benny is a very weird duck, was a weird duck. He would introduce everybody but me. So my mother pipes up, "Hey, Benny, who's the drummer?" You know? And I says, "Oh my God, that's her." So that was my first experience. And I did go on the road for a short time with him, and he liked me. But he never spoke to me, never spoke. When they fired me, his brother Irving Goodman came over and said, "Benny says you should go home." And that was the end of it. And then after about, I'd say 8 or 10 weeks, Dizzy told me he's going to leave. He's going to New York. And I felt terrible. I felt abandoned, you know. And he did go, and he says, "Will you come to New York? We'll help you get started in New York." Because a kid, I was scared to death, the big city. So we hugged each other goodbye, and he went to New York. And I continued playing. Some of the guys in Philly were John Coltrane, Philly Joe Jones, a bunch of good players, Buddy DeFranco, all good people out of Philly. So I started to think about what Dizzy told me, and there was a trumpet player by the name of Carl Warwick. They call him Bama. Very light-skinned black guy, great guy, great guy. And he encouraged me to go to New York. He said, "Come over, I will help you, and Dizzy will help you." And as scared as I was, I made the move. I had about $1.47, you know, and a train ticket. And I went over there and found Dizzy, and he took me right over to Oscar Pettiford, who was at that time one of the greatest bass players, you know, around. And he said, "Here's your drummer," to Oscar. And Oscar loved Dizzy. He says, "Okay, let's go." So my second night in New York, we got on a train and went to Boston to the Tic-Tac Club. I says, "What happened to New York? I was here and I'm gone." But that was another experience, another piece of luck that I fell into. Again, I was able to do this work.
To hold down the drum chair with Dizzy and and Parker and the various people in New York City is something else.
My first job in New York was with Barney Bigard, who was an old style player with Duke Ellington, Dixieland more or less, but it was a job on 52nd Street. I grabbed it. It was wonderful. And actually they liked me, even though I was considered a modernist at that time. I played looser than they did and got along with them very, very well. And Barney's a great guy, wonderful guy, and he put up with me, you know, whatever. And that was a very, very good learning experience. And then I got a call from Leonard Feather, the English critic, who was well known. And he recognized me as a good drummer, a new guy, a young kid. And he called me to do a record date. And wow, my first record date, first call. I said, sure, just tell me where and when. And I borrowed a set of drums. I went up to the Raymond Scott Studios on 52nd Street near 6th Avenue, New York. Got up there, got off the elevator, carrying the drums, went into the studio, and I stopped cold in my tracks. I was there on the piano, sitting there, playing, was Art Tatum, who was the king of kings of the piano. There was none better. There still is today, none better than that. I did a 180, completely turned around. I started to walk out. And Leonard Feather caught me at the elevator, says, where are you going? You got to play, you're on this date. I says, I cannot play with Art Tatum. I mean, I wouldn't even think of it. This is way above my ability. He says, get back in there, you can do it, everything will be fine. And I went back and I set up and I played very carefully. It was George Yall on the band, Joe Thomas. Let me see, the guitar player was Chuck Wayne, guys like that. It was kind of a mishmash of a band. And Art Tatum, who was above everybody in the band. And I played very softly and tried to just fit in. After the date, Art came over. He was blind. He couldn't really see. He could see a little bit out of the side of his eye. And he put his arm around me because he knew I was nervous as hell, you know. And he says, you did real, real good. And you're going to be fine. And boy, did that help me for the ongoing career that I had. He saw that fear that I had, and he really made me feel good. And I'll never forget him for that. Great guy.
I'd heard Art Tatum, actually before I came to New York. Art Tatum used to play Buffalo, New York rather regularly at a place called McVan's on the other side of town. I was working at a place called the Anchor Bar right on Main Street in Buffalo. Art Tatum would come to town, and whenever we'd finish our evening at the Anchor Bar, I was working with a small trio, and we'd go over to hear Art's last set at McVan's, and it was always a really amazing experience. You know. You have to struggle for words to describe Art's playing. He was in a class by himself. Technically, innovatively, his ideas, his stamina, his speed, accuracy with both hands, just a phenomenon. And nothing you could say about him really aptly describes his great ability, his great talent.
After we closed the Onyx Club, which was about 4 weeks, I walked down the street towards Fifth Avenue, and there's a club called Tondaleo. It wasn't really a jazz club, but I walked by and I heard this fabulous piano player, just really swinging like crazy. And I walk in, it's a little guy sitting on a telephone booth, you know, telephone book, excuse me, to get him a little higher into the piano. And I'm listening, he sounded like a whole orchestra. It was unbelievable the way he played. After he came off, I introduced myself to him, and he's Earl Gardner, who had just arrived in New York from Pittsburgh. And this guy could really play, and he always could play to the very end. And he was looking for a drummer. So he hired Jimmy Butts on bass and myself on drums.
I had an interesting experience. I was riding down on the subway one day with Earl Garner, who was also working on 52nd Street. And we'd started talking. I asked him the usual silly questions about how do you play the way you play and all that. And he told me, he said, Hank says, you know, he said, I learned one thing. It took me 20 years to learn what to leave out. And I thought that was a very profound statement. You know. So you don't have to play all the notes that are possible. There are millions of notes, but you don't have to play every one. Basie proved that, of course.
All this time I was on 52nd Street working up and down, I'd hear people saying, "The bird is coming." I'm saying, "The bird is coming? What bird? A sparrow, a robin, a pigeon? What bird?" Charlie Parker.
I went to California in 1945 with Dizzy after I broke up my band, the first band I had. And I came back again to New York in 47, the early part of 47. And that's when I decided to have a band of my own permanently. And Miles was in my original band. I had Miles, I had Max, I had Tommy Potter, and Al Haig in my band. Mm-hmm. Another band I had Stan Levey, I had Curly Russell, I had Miles, and George Wellington.
The big night came, and about 2 weeks later, and Charlie Parker was here. Well, he looked like he just rolled off a garbage truck. There was something so bad in my life. His shoes didn't match. Looks like he slept in his suit for about a month, and his hair standing straight up. Looked like Don King. And there he was. I said, "My God, what is this guy? What can he do? How good is he? He's like a legend already." And on Monday nights in the Downbeat Club on 52nd Street, they had an open jam session. And him and I walked in. I met him. We kind of talked for a while. And we walked into the Downbeat Club. And he took out his horn, which was in a paper bag, full of rubber bands and cellophane to keep it together, and sat in. Well, within 4 bars, everybody went absolutely crazy because he was then the Charlie Parker that he is now. He was already so far advanced of everybody. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. So he gave me a little motion like that because the drummer was a older type drummer, you know. He said, come on up and play, give me the eye. And I did, the guy let me play. And as soon as we played like 8 bars together, we were like this. We knew we were musically bonded. It was the weirdest experience I ever had. I had that with Dizzy, but I really had it with Parker. And amazing experience, out of body experience. We used to play all night on 52nd Street. We'd have a job here, a job there. And then we'd go up to Minton's and start playing about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning and play till 2. Then knock it off, try to get some rest. And we became very fast friends. In fact, we moved in together in Harlem, around 121st Street. We got a place together. And it was a madhouse because we were going all night, all day. It was all music, you know. And the best time I ever had musically with him.
There was nothing to do but play, you know, and we had a lot of fun trying to play, you know. I did. Mm-hmm. Plenty of jam sessions. Meant much late hours. Pretty good food. Just nice, clean living, you know. Mm-hmm. But basically speaking, much poverty.
Well, living with Charlie Parker, as I did, was like living in the eye of a hurricane. It never stopped. Just faster and faster and more playing. Of course, there was a lot of drugs involved in those days. Everybody did that. And we did it too, and a little bit to excess, I would say. But we had our share. But the music that we played was just beyond belief. It was all new, all wonderful. And we had the best time doing it. And we didn't make much money, but we had a lot of good times, a lot of good music.
I think one of the first times I heard Charlie Parker was when I was in the Army. I came home on furlough, and the guy I grew up called Tiny Khan took me to hear Charlie Parker. And I heard him a few times. I was on furlough. I heard him with Max Roach, and I heard him with Stan Levey. And what I do remember, I'll never forget with Stan, because I didn't know him in those days, whatever tune they were playing, sometimes Charlie Parker would play 30 choruses, and then Dizzy would play 30 choruses, then Al Haig would play 30 choruses, and Stan would be sitting there playing, am I doing the left hand? Yeah. He'd be yelling, take it out, take it out.
Dizzy came by one night, I think at the time he was working with Cab Calloway's band. And he sat in the band, and I was quite fascinated with the fellow. And we became very good friends, and until this day we are, you know? Mm-hmm. But that was the first time I ever had the pleasure to meet Dizzy Gillespie.
Well, was he playing the same way then, before he played with you?
I don't remember precisely. I just know that he was playing oh, what you might call in the vernacular of the streets a buku of horn, you know?
Buku?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, just like all of the horn packed up in once, you know? And we used to go around different places and jam together. We had quite a bit of fun in those days.
The music has different stages of development. There was King Oliver on the trumpet, and then after that there came Louis Armstrong on the trumpet, and it was a little different, but he sounded very close to King Oliver. And then there came Roy Eldridge, who he played a lot of the style of Louis Armstrong, remember that? And then I came along, and then there was Miles and Fats Navarro, came two of them. But they were trying to play like me. You know, so all of us got our, I tried to play like Roy Eldridge. Everybody's got their hero, you know.
Before we came along playing the music, a guy either played legato or staccato. Well, staccato. See, but we do, the way that we play, we play them all together. You see, if you will notice, some of the notes I'm attacking and some I'm slurring.
Well, I heard Dizzy, Art Blakey, Bird, Lucky Thompson, Sarah, Gene Ammons. I heard all of them at once. I said, that's the most fun I ever had with my clothes on. I said, God damn, can you imagine that? Now I'm 15. But see, we were on the verge of that anyway. I knew they were playing, but I mean, it wasn't Dizzy first, it was the whole thing together, like, bam, here's what you want to be, you know? And my head just carried me right to Bird and Dizzy.
In the same building that Miles and I lived in, right below us was Billie Holiday. On the same floor was Sarah Vaughan. A whole bunch of guys, Freddie Webster, a fine trumpet player. So it was kind of a musical enclave, and it was really fun. We all got along beautifully, and there was some good music that came out of that.
We didn't have much money, so I would tell Irene, I'd say, now fix some cornbread, and we'd buy some cabbage, put potatoes in, you know, like cabbage. Bird come downstairs, right? Now the cornbread is this big, right? Now we don't have no money, just a little bit of it, right? So I said, Bird, you want something to eat? He come in. Now cornbread is like this, right? You cut this half, yeah, and eat the rest. He just took everything to the extreme. That's when he was like he is, what he is.
I remember you, man, seeing Stan Levey's name all with Bird and all of that. You guys were like the old, the first team, man. I mean, we were little greenback punks coming in from Seattle, you know, just glad to get to New York to be able to watch everybody do their thing, because we just heard stories. Because people forget back in that day, there was no MTV or anything to tell anybody what was going on. There was probably one jazz station in Seattle we could catch was Jimmy Lyons from San Francisco, and the Downbeat magazine. But I finally got to New York, and word of mouth we'd hear things, and I finally got to New York. Oscar Pettiford took me there the first time to do two arrangements, and he took me to all the joints, and one of the joints where you were at Minton's, which was the Mecca. That's where everything was happening. And I used to see you guys go through the New York rituals, man. Like they'd have 20 guys sitting around with horns and sacks and all kind of stuff, paper sacks. And Bird was call them demons. And so they all jump up on the stand and will say they played with Bird. And as he's kicking off, he said, "Be natural." In the key of "Be natural." And you guys were flying along, and the stage emptied quick, because that's a half step up from what everybody ever knew how to play it.
I remember working with one of the finest drummers, perhaps the finest drummer in New York, And I'm sure if he was here, he would agree with me, Stan Levey. He was working with a group, the Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker group, at a club in New York called Clark Monroe's Spotlight on 52nd Street, sometimes known as Spring Street. Because on either side of the street for a block and perhaps a block and a half, there were clubs on both sides of the street. You could walk in one right across the street, walk in the other, back and forth all night, you know. But Stan was working with the group, and I was lucky enough to be included in that group for a short time.
I remember getting the first few Dial record company records that I ever had. Charlie Parker was playing on them. Wardell Gray and Dexter Gordon were playing some two-tenor things. When I heard Charlie Parker play, I said, what the hell is that going on? My goodness, so inventive. I mean, he was coming out of left field and didn't sound like anybody. He didn't sound like he was influenced by anybody. I'm sure he was, but you couldn't tell it from the notes that were coming out.
During our engagement on 52nd Street with Dizzy and Charlie Parker, a young fella used to come around every night and copy down chords and listening and listening and listening and listening. He was a young trumpet player by the name of Miles Davis, who later became an icon. And every night he got a little more aggressive as far as talking to us and coming back. And one night he came back to the dressing room and he came up to Dizzy. He said, Dizzy, I can play anything you can play. And Dizzy said, yeah, but an octave lower.
My influence mostly was Dizzy. But also first it was Clark Terry.
St. Louis trumpet player.
Yeah. St. Louis is a place when the big bands used to come in town and up from New Orleans on the boat. And if the big bands, when they needed a trumpet player, they would stop in St. Louis. And I was 15 when I was playing professional. I had a union card when I was 15. But it was mostly Bruns, Eddie Random, Clark Terry, Levi. That was it. And another guy named Cliff King. But that's it. When the big band needed a trumpet player or a show drummer, you know, they would come when they stopped in St. Louis, they would pick up a trumpet player. So they wanted me, but I couldn't go anywhere.
Across the street from the Downbeat Club where Parker and I were playing on Mondays and Tuesdays or whatever, there was a tenor player by the name of Ben Webster. I'm sure you'll heard of him. He was Duke Ellington's player. He played Cottontail, a great player of that era. And he heard that we were over there. We were the latest thing, so he wanted to have us in the band, which he did. He hired us. And the first night went pretty well, and the second night, Ben likes to drink, and he got a little stoned, you know. And he called Cottontail, and it's a pretty fast tune, and he couldn't play it, you know. And Parker just took over and played the whole thing perfectly, you know, his solo. So he got a little peed off on that one, and he started looking at his phone. He's a gigantic guy, Ben Webster, strong, big guy. And he said, he turned around, he said, you two get the hell out of here. And we were fired the second night.
I've never been so enraptured or fascinated in my life as the days when the rules were being made. You guys were carving out the catechism of what the new music was all about. Because it was music that took over, and it revolutionized the music in the world.
When you talk about bebop music, and we know it came out of the African American or black musical context, but even more importantly than that is that jazz was stale for a minute. Musicians were rebelling against the form that was prior to bebop. So what happens is that due again to the creativity involved in jazz music, to the evolving processes of jazz music, things take place. And these great musicians found ways in time and tempo to create new music. Music unheard of at the time. You look back on it and you say, well, I can do that. But in the 1940s and late 1930s, this was new music. The music was so new that people didn't understand it. It took about a decade or two that people really understood what bebop was.
At that time, it wasn't terribly popular with most people, as a matter of fact. Stan would probably verify that, because a lot of people, including some musicians, rejected the style, maybe because it was too different. And you know, people hate to change. There's sort of a built-in resistance to people for change, even if it's good. And if it's particularly difficult to do, there's more resistance. I think that might have been the problem. But eventually it did catch on. That's the type of music that we call bebop.
You know, if you see transcribed pages of bebop solos, the ink is so, there's so much ink there you can't even see the white paper. It takes a person, if you can play, that's what counts for me. Of course, then you have to have the talent and the sentimentality or whatever the other emotions are. But the main thing is you gotta know your acts.
Bebop was much more than just the music, you know. It was a way of speaking, the colloquialisms. It was a sensibility. There was the slangs that were like opposites. I remember saying one night at Newport or something, I said, how was so-and-so? I said, oh man, he was terrible, man, which meant great. And this man's wife was telling me, so, oh man, did you, Quincy was talking bad about you. I said, he's bad, you know. That's, at that time, it was, the opposites were, you know, that was the colorful slang then.
About a month down the line, after we got through playing these little clubs with Parker and such, Dizzy called, and he said, we're going to do a band with Charlie Parker, me, Stan Levey, me, and Curly Russell and Al Haig. And wow, I said, this can't be real. This is earth-shaking, and it was. And we started rehearsing in the Three Deuces in the afternoon. And Dizzy brought in all this music, you know, confirmation, bebop, all the tunes that he did. And Al Haig was incredible. And the band immediately gelled. Within 30 minutes, it was together. It was a done deal. It was a perfect package. We rehearsed maybe 2 or 3 days, and then we opened in the Three Deuces, and everything broke loose. Chaotic. People couldn't get in the door. It just went crazy for about 8 weeks, the whole time we were there. The last 2 weeks of the engagement with Dizzy and Charlie Parker in New York, I got a call from Woody Herman's manager. Now, Woody Herman at that time was the #1 band in the country, in the world. Tremendous. And he offered me $250 a week, which at that time was an unbelievable amount of money. And I went to Dizzy and said, man, what should I do? This guy's going to offer me $250, but I'm making $66 a week with Dizzy. And the kind of guy Dizzy is, he just says, just go and take it. When you come back, your job will be here. And I went to play with this #1 big band in the world, and I couldn't read music, and I didn't have any drums. So I played on Davy Tuff's set, and I got by pretty well. They liked me pretty good. I was out about 2 months with the band. Davy had gotten sick. And when I came back, Dizzy had done the record dates that I wanted to do. Salt Peanuts, that whole group for Musicraft, which I missed. Big Sid Catlett did them and did a great job, a fantastic job. And I was really sorry I missed those. I should have been on that. But that's the kind of guy Dizzy was. Go get the money. Go get it.
I think that both he and Max Roach, obviously had a powerful impact. Max Roach certainly much better known at that time than Stan was, but if you listen to Stan's playing from that period, there was a lot of similarity between those two players. The other thing that comes to mind about that aspect of his career is that he was playing, and again, I think had the good fortune to be part of a scene at a time when a lot of the racial problems that began to emerge later were not as present as they have since become, so that as a white player, as a young white drummer, he was able to play with African Americans, and everybody loved everybody. And as he has said, with Dizzy, it was a matter of whether you could cut the music or not. If you could play it, then you deserved to be there. If you didn't, then you didn't. And that was a great experience for a young drummer to have. Things changed later, of course, but at that time, I can't think of a better opportunity than to have been able to grow up as a young musician playing with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. That's magical.
When you talk about whites playing with blacks, it's really not that important. What really is important is the music and how well they played the music, and that's the key. And in this case, you had Stan Levey playing with the pioneers, Bird, Diz, Miles, and he was right there. Why was Stan there? Well, simply put, Stan was an outstanding drummer. He knew the pace of the music. He knew the feeling of bebop. And this had a lot to do with that whole concept. It wasn't so much a racial thing unless people made it a racial thing. But white musicians were playing with black musicians, a long time, still do.
I'd like to tell you about my first trip to California. Dizzy called me after we had done all this work in New York and everything, and he says, we're going to California. We got an 8-week job there, and it should be very interesting. It's nice out there. The weather is good, and so we're ready to go. And I said, well, we're going to have the same band. He says, yeah, except we're not taking Curly Russell. Now, Curly Russell is the bass player, and we had worked together for a long time. And we traded off carrying the band. In other words, the ferocious tempos that we played. In some cases, he would take over a little bit, then I would relieve him a bit, you know, as far as putting the edge on the music, on the rhythm. So he says, no, Curly's not going. I said, why? He said, I'm hiring a young guy by the name of Ray Brown. I says, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I had no idea who he was or what he was or anything. I said, Dizzy, why are you taking apart the rhythm section that we had that worked so well? He says, I found this kid in Detroit and he's fantastic. I said, well, it's your band. Do what you want. And I worried about that for a while. And then the band we took out was Charlie Parker, Stan Levey, Ray Brown, Milt Jackson, Dizzy Gillespie, and we got on the train. And the train ride was a disaster because in those days, you had to go to Chicago first, and then you laid over for a couple of hours, and then that was the 20th Century Limited, and then you took the train to California. And I met this young guy, pretty cocky guy, this Ray Brown. I didn't know how he played. And Milt Jackson, I knew nothing about him at all. And we're on the train, and we stopped for water. In those days, they had a water stop where there was a steam engine, and we had to get water. And we're stopping, and the train is hissing and all the noise it makes. And I look out the window, I see this little speck out there with a little suitcase. I'm saying, man, it's a desert. What is this guy doing out there? I looked real close, and it was Charlie Parker, walking in the desert. And I said to Dizzy, I think you better look at this. And he looked out there, and he says, what is it? And I said, I think it's your saxophone player, Charlie Parker. He said, well, you better go get him. I said, wait a minute, it's your band. He said, no, you go get him. You're his friend. And I ran out. It was about maybe 200 yards out there. He was staggering around. He was ill. He didn't have his medicine or whatever. And let him know that there's nothing out there he can get. Nothing's going to help him. So I got him back on the train, and he was a mess all the way back. And we finally pulled into Union Station, and he was like a zombie, you know, really sick. And that was our first trip to California, L.A. And I was still worrying about the bass player because it was quite important, you know, the ferocious, speedy tempos that we played. And they also added Lucky Thompson on tenor in case Parker didn't come in on time, which he very seldom did. And the first night Dizzy beats off a real fast tune.
Billy Berries. It was a hell of an experience, but we upset California, the music lovers in California. We were there for 8 weeks, and went away, and we came back, and I came back with a big band and played there. And that was a profound experience there, because a lot of the movie stars came out, such as Ava Gardner. You know.
Dizzy beat off the first tune of the night at a ferocious tempo, really fast. And we got right into it, and it was flying. And I hear this great bass sound coming through, which I'd never heard before. Every note clear as a bell, and the tempos are right there. And boy, I just looked at that kid and just grinned. He grinned over at me, and he was what he became later, Ray Brown. Great bass player. So we had Al Haig on piano, Ray Brown, and myself. That was a pretty good rhythm section.
They say that they weren't very well received, but I think they were, because they were, I mean, it was a very underground thing. I think New York was a few years ahead of Los Angeles in that particular thing.
We did good business there because they had never heard this type of music, bebop or whatever you want to call it. They always had like Slim and Slam, comedy acts and stuff like that. Harry the Hipster, you know. And we had all the movie stars come in every night. Jennifer Jones, all these kind of, Ava Gardner, every night in there. Peter Lawford. And when we first got there, Billy Berg says, well, who's the singer? Well, we didn't have a singer. But the only thing we sang was Salt Peanuts, where Dizzy sang Salt Peanuts, Salt Peanuts. And that was about it. So Billy Berg had bought a band that he didn't know about. He didn't know the style of it. But we did a pretty good business. All the musicians came. Quite a good experience. Also, we, through the 8 weeks that we were there, Charlie Parker was going downhill. He couldn't get the right drugs that he needed to keep him going. And he just started drinking heavier and eating heavier, and he was a mess. Finally, the job was over after the 8 weeks, and Dizzy gave me all the plane tickets. We came back by plane this time. 21 stops, up and down. Took about 20 hours to come back by plane in those days. That was 1945. And I couldn't find Charlie Parker. Went to the hotel, he wasn't there. I went out, took a cab, something about $20, $30. In those days, that was a lot of money for a cab. Could not find him anywhere. So I left the ticket at the hotel, at the desk for him. He never got it. He never showed up. He never got on a plane. We just left and went back to New York, and he got in big trouble here. He wound up getting arrested, setting fire to his room, drunk, and wound up in the Camarillo for about a year. We got him pretty well straightened out. And the next time I saw him was about a year or so later. In New York, he had bloated up, he was real heavy, and a very subdued Charlie Parker. One of the jobs I had was with Billie Holiday. I was her drummer, and she was really something at that time. The clubs along 52nd Street were very noisy, a lot of noise and carrying on. And when she appeared, the room would go dark, and there'd be a little pin spot. And she would walk into that pin spot, and boy, the silence was deafening when she walked on stage. She was really a fantastic person. She had a great aura about her and control without even opening her mouth. It just controlled the whole room. And she was quite a character and quite a nice girl, actually. Had a tough life, very tough.
She was right there with this sound that no one else had. There was no one who sang like Billie Holiday. No one. She was that important. She had that much emotion that left people in tears. People just said, why is she so sad? But she was emotional in terms of the vocal context of the song.
We all had a dressing room upstairs with Coleman Hawkins and Billy. And my first night with the band, I saw this white powder on a mirror, and they're all sniffing it up. And I found out what that was. That was pretty interesting for a young guy to see that stuff. And it was quite an experience on 52nd Street, especially with Coleman Hawkins. He had a great band, terrific band. And Billy was great to me, and we got along quite well. In the literary department, there are many, many books out on top icon musicians, really top men. I am very fortunate to be in those books as a part of them, with Dizzy, Charlie Parker's book, Miles Davis' book, Coleman Hawkins, etc., etc. And it's makes me feel very good to be included in those as a good friend and as a favored player. They use me as a player. They all like me. And it's just good to look back on that and read those books. Some of my favorite drummers are Max Roach, Philly Joe Jones, Roy Haynes, Don Lamont, Dave Tuff, Big Sid Catlett, people like that. These guys were really polished drummers. They knew how to work the drum set, and they had good ears. They listened to the music, and that's the main thing. Listening to and absorbing the music and becoming a part of it. Shelly Manne was very good at that, a whole bunch of guys, and we miss them all.
It's surrealistic. You can't believe that the people that have inspired you all your life since you're that high, and then you use them, they're your role models and your idols and everything else, then you get to be to work with them, you become friendly with them, and you create with them, and it's like they can never go away. Basie was like that. Basie, I met Basie when I was 13 years old, and Clark Terry, who taught me how to put my trumpet to my mouth, you know. It's time is no joke. It's an amazing phenomenon.
Duke Ellington said it's only two kinds of music, good or bad. And bebop was good music. It was new music, and it was being brought by people that I don't think they were well known at the time, but they were sensational.
Ever since I've ever heard music, I thought it should be very clean, very precise, as clean as possible anyway, you know, and more or less to the people, you know, something they could understand, something that was beautiful, you know. Because definitely there's stories and stories and stories that can be told in the musical idiom, you know. You wouldn't say idiom either. It's so hard to describe music other than the basic way to describe it. Music is basically melody, harmony, and rhythm. But, I mean, people can do much more with music than that. It can be very descriptive in all kinds of ways, you know, all walks of life.
I guess we all have a tendency to take it for granted that all the people, all of you, while we're all walking around on this earth together, you take the existence for granted. And then when they're no longer here, one great thing about music is that the chemical energy goes away, but the sound and the soul and the spirit holds on forever. And we were fortunate, I think very, very fortunate, that the time that we happened to be born and came up, even 10 years either way, we were some of the luckiest people alive because we got a chance to not only participate in some of the best music that was ever made, but also to hear some of the best music ever made. And we take it for granted when all these giants are around, the Byrds and Lesters and Basie and Ella and Sarah and Duke and Dizzy and everybody. It's Miles. It's astounding, you know, when you look back and you see the whole, have a focus on the whole eras. It's just awesome. But I wouldn't trade this time that we came up than any other time, because that's what it was happening. Songwriters, musicians, and everything else, and the bands, that's what was happening.
The kind of drumming that Stan did, that Max did, was drumming in which drummers listened to what the other players were doing, in which they were musicians, they were not soloists, at least not all the time. Drummers today tend to, and I hate to generalize about this, but there's a tendency among many young drummers to not really listen to what other players are doing, to not take the responsibility for filling out the textures, for supporting a solo, for energizing the swing, to hear the sensitivity to hear what a soloist is doing and stay with him as he's going on a kind of a course and his momentum is being established and the drummer takes it along. That's very subtle stuff. And it takes musicality, it takes intelligence, and it takes a certain kind of self-effacing quality that certainly was true with Stan, with Max Roach, with all of the drummers from that era.
When I talk about people like Stan Levey And Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, you know, I wax eloquent because these were elegant people. And, you know, it's just a pleasure just to remember the great experiences I had working with these guys.